Three true stories that explain Alaska's missing persons crisis. In the United States, around 600,000 people are reported missing every single year. For most of them, their cases get resolved. They're found. But in Alaska, the story is tragically different. Alaska consistently has the highest rate of missing person reports in the nation, often more than double the national average. Since people started keeping track, tens of thousands have been reported missing in the vast, wild expanse of America's last frontier. But these aren't just numbers on a page. They're stories. Stories of adventurers, politicians, and everyday people who walked into one of the world's last great wildernesses and were never seen again. The reasons why are often shrouded in mystery, leading to all sorts of speculation about strange energy vortexes or mythical creatures. But the truth is often far more tangible and way more terrifying. Today, we're telling three of those stories. These aren't tales of conspiracies or monsters. They're about the stark, brutal reality of how quickly the Alaskan wild can swallow a person whole. They are case studies that reveal the true culprit behind Alaska's missing persons crisis, the land itself. Our first story begins not on the ground, but in the air, with two of the most powerful politicians in the country. Section 1. The Vanished Flight of 72. Let's set the scene. It's October 1972, and American politics are on fire. Richard Nixon is cruising towards a landslide re-election, and the Democratic Party is fighting to keep its power in Congress. A key player in that fight was the U.S. House Majority Leader Thomas Hale Boggs Sr., a charismatic and powerful Democrat from Louisiana. This was a political heavyweight, a man who sat on the Warren Commission after the Kennedy assassination, whose voice helped shape the nation's laws. To show party unity, Boggs flew to Alaska to campaign for the state's only congressman, a freshman Democrat named Nick Begich. Begich was in a tight race against a rising Republican challenger, Don Young. For Begich, having the House Majority Leader stump for him was a massive deal. For Boggs, it was just part of the job, a whirlwind tour of the largest state in the Union to lock down a seat for his party. The plan was a classic barnstorming trip across Alaska for fundraisers and rallies. On the morning of October 16, 1972, they were scheduled to fly from Anchorage to the capital, Juneau, for another campaign event. With them were Begich's aide, Russell Brown, and their pilot, a 38-year-old named Don Johns. Their plane was a twin-engine Cessna 310C, a reliable workhorse for travel in a state with famously few roads. For guys like Begich and Johns, flying over huge stretches of rugged wilderness was like hailing a taxi in New York City. It was simply how you got around. The flight should have been straightforward, just a few hours over the dramatic landscapes of the Chugach Mountains and the Gulf of Alaska. They boarded the small plane under gray skies, with no sense that their routine flight was about to become one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. Just four men, confident in their plane and their mission, about to fly straight into a void. The flight plan for the Cessna, tail number N1812H, was a direct 575-mile route from Anchorage to Juneau. The pilot, Don Johns, was no rookie. He had thousands of hours in Alaska's tough skies. But the weather that day was bad. A low-pressure system was churning in the Gulf of Alaska, bringing low clouds, turbulence, and the risk of icing, a deadly condition where supercooled water freezes on a plane's wings, destroying its ability to fly. The plane took off from Anchorage just before 9 a.m. At 9:09 a.m., Johns made a routine check-in. That was the last time anyone ever heard from him, Boggs, Begich, or Brown. No distress call, no mayday, no hint of trouble. The plane, carrying two of the nation's congressmen, just kept flying south and vanished from the face of the earth. Hours crawled by. In Juneau, the welcoming party waited, their excitement slowly turning to worry. When the Cessna didn't arrive, the alarm was raised. Officials scrambled, checking flight logs, calling air traffic control, and trying to raise the pilot on the radio. Nothing but absolute silence. The plane was officially missing. You have to understand, the route from Anchorage to Juneau is one of the most hostile corridors on the planet. The plane would have flown over Prince William Sound, a labyrinth of fjords, glaciers, and jagged, ice-capped mountains that shoot thousands of feet straight out of the sea. This is a vertical world of rock and ice. It's a landscape that's actively alive. Glaciers carve through valleys, dropping house-sized chunks of ice into the water. Weather can change in an instant, wrapping mountains in thick fog and unleashing hurricane-force winds. To disappear here isn't like disappearing in a field. It's to disappear into a three-dimensional maze. The plane had flown directly into the heart of that maze and was gone. The disappearance of a House Majority Leader kicked off one of the largest search and rescue operations in American history. The Coast Guard, Navy, Army, and Air Force all jumped in. A fleet of 40 military aircraft and 50 civilian planes scoured the region. For 39 agonizing days, they flew grid patterns over 325,000 square miles, a search area bigger than the state of Texas. They searched the mountains, the glaciers, and the dark, frigid waters of the Gulf of Alaska. They were looking for anything: a glint of metal, an oil slick, a scrap of clothing. They were also listening for a signal. The plane was required to carry an emergency locator transmitter, or ELT, designed to activate on impact and broadcast a distress signal. But for 39 days, the airwaves were silent. This suggested the ELT either malfunctioned, was destroyed on impact, or, as a later investigation found, might have been a portable unit the pilot left behind in another plane. Day after day, the search turned up nothing. The vast, indifferent landscape held its secrets. Every canyon, every crevasse, every square mile of forest was a potential gravesite, but they were all empty. On November 24, 1972, with winter closing in and no leads left, the official air search was called off. Not a single piece of the Cessna 310 was ever found. No wreckage, no personal items, no human remains. It was as if the plane and the 4 men inside had simply been erased. So what happened? The most logical theory, backed by the National Transportation Safety Board, is that the pilot hit severe weather, experienced catastrophic icing, and lost control. A sudden, violent crash into a remote mountainside or a deep dive into the ocean would explain the lack of a distress call. Wreckage could have been buried instantly by an avalanche or sunk so deep it would never be found. Some theories point to Portage Pass, a notoriously nasty shortcut where the plane could have crashed and been swallowed by a glacier. And in a place where military planes from the 50s are only now being spit out by melting glaciers, it's entirely plausible the Cessna 310 was entombed in a river of ice, its final resting place still moving invisibly toward the sea. The story of Hale Boggs and Nick Begich is a chilling lesson. In Alaska, status and technology can mean nothing. The wild doesn't care if you're a congressman. A modern aircraft, filled with powerful people, was utterly defeated and consumed by the terrain and the weather. Their story is the ultimate testament to the scale of the Alaskan wilderness, a place so vast it can take everything and give nothing back. Section 2. The Lone Hunter. Long before Alaska became a backdrop for reality TV, it was a magnet for a certain kind of dreamer, the kind who read Jack London and wanted a life of rugged self-sufficiency. In the fall of 1976, a 25-year-old from New York named Gary Frank Sotherden was one of those dreamers. Described by his family as a free spirit, Gary had already worked on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, but he wanted a deeper immersion in the wild. He planned the trip of a lifetime, a winter season trapping along the remote Porcupine River, just north of the Arctic Circle. This wasn't a casual camping trip. It was a deliberate choice to live off the land in one of the most isolated places on Earth. Gary wasn't a total novice, and he and a friend made a plan to travel to the trapping grounds together. Once there, his friend suggested they stick together for safety. But Gary had his own ideas. His brother, Steve, later remembered that Gary was very independent and loved the outdoors, and he liked to do things the way he wanted to do things. So, they agreed to trap on opposite sides of the river and meet up in the spring to fly back to civilization. Gary was dropped off in the wilderness with his supplies, finally living the adventure he'd been looking for, a solitary man against a backdrop of silent forest and a cold, slow-moving river. He was setting out to test himself against nature, confident he could survive the long, dark Arctic winter. As the Alaskan autumn of 1976 deepened, Gary Sotherden was alone on his side of the Porcupine River, setting his trap lines. We can only imagine what those first few weeks were like. The profound silence, the spectacle of the northern lights, the hard, satisfying work of staying alive. He was living his dream. Across the river, his friend was running his own lines, both men knowing they were alone together in the vast wilderness, connected only by the river and their plan to meet up. But when the spring of 1977 arrived, there was only silence from Gary's side of the river. The time for their rendezvous came and went. Gary never showed up. His friend waited, scanning the opposite bank for a campfire or any sign of movement. There was nothing. Concern turned to alarm. Word got back to Gary's family in New York. Disappearing without a word just wasn't like him. The family, desperate for answers, hired a mountain guide to conduct a private search. The guide canoed up the Porcupine River to where Gary had set up his camp. What he found was a ghost scene. He discovered the campsite, clearly abandoned for some time. He also found some of Gary's personal effects, including his ID and a pair of broken glasses. But of Gary himself, there was no sign. The wilderness had taken him, leaving behind only these few small fragments of his life. For years, the Southerton family lived in agony. They had no answers, only a profound sense of loss. They eventually put up a gravestone for Gary in their family plot with a simple, heartbreaking inscription, "Lost in Alaska." For 2 decades, that was the end of the story. Gary was just another statistic. Then, in July 1997, 20 years after Gary disappeared, a hunter was walking along the bank of the Porcupine River. There, in the brush, he made a grim discovery, a human skull. Alaska state troopers were called in, but a search of the area found no other remains. The skull was sent to the state medical examiner's office and cataloged as unidentified. But there was one critical clue. The skull had distinct puncture marks and fractures. A forensic exam suggested a chilling cause of death, a bear attack. Still, the victim's identity remained a mystery. The skull sat in storage for years, another cold case. It stayed that way until 2022, a full 46 years after Gary Southerton was last seen. Thanks to advances in genetic genealogy, cold case investigators were able to extract DNA from the forgotten skull. They built a family tree, searching public databases for a match. The search led them to Steve Southerton, Gary's brother, who had submitted his own DNA years earlier. Investigators reached out, and a match was confirmed. The skull found on the banks of the Porcupine River belonged to Gary Frank Southerton. After nearly half a century, his family finally had an answer. The evidence pointed to a sudden and terrifying end. Gary was likely killed by a bear, probably not long after he started his expedition in the fall of 1976. His brother Steve said the reality was much more brutal than I had hoped. But there was also a sense of closure. "We've been working on it for 45 years, and it's nice that things came to a conclusion," he said. Gary's story is a stark reminder that in Alaska, the food chain is very real, and humans aren't always at the top. The wilderness isn't just a backdrop for adventure. It's an active participant, and it can hide its secrets for decades, only to give them up one small, bleached piece at a time. Section 3. Lost in the Shadow of the Mountain. Not everyone who vanishes in Alaska is a young adventurer. Some are seasoned, meticulous, and deeply respectful of the wilderness. People like Thomas Seibold. In 2012, the 32-year-old from Germany wasn't a tourist. He was a dedicated student and instructor of the wild. He trained at the Teaching Drum Outdoor School in Wisconsin, which specializes in primitive survival skills. His mentor described him as a very experienced outdoorsman and a gentle soul. He knew how to build shelters, find food, and navigate without modern tools. This is the guy you'd bet on to survive, no question. In the summer of 2012, Thomas embarked on a 5-month trip to Alaska that he had prepared for extensively. This was his pilgrimage. His destination was the Brooks Range, one of the most remote and untouched mountain ranges on the continent, specifically the area around gates of the Arctic National Park. This park is the definition of wild. It's 8.5 million acres with no roads, no trails, and no campsites. You enter on its terms. Thomas arranged to stay at a remote cabin on the Upper Ambler River, just outside the park. He spent time there with the owner before she and her son left the area on September 27th, leaving Thomas completely alone. That was the last time anyone is confirmed to have seen him. He had a solid plan: spend the next month and a half exploring and practicing his skills, then fly home in mid-November. He was prepared, he was experienced, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. Thomas Seibold's plan was one of careful, deliberate exploration. From the cabin, he intended to make several short trips into the surrounding wilderness. His final goal, before winter truly hit, was to trek about 30 miles to the small village of Kobuk, where he'd catch a flight back to civilization. For a man with his skills, it was a challenging but totally achievable journey. At the cabin, investigators later found his diary. The last entry was dated October 7th. In it, he wrote that he was about to go on a several-day exploration. He mentioned scouting the mountains and preparing firewood at the cabin, which showed he fully intended to return there before his final trek out. After that entry, the pen stopped. From that point on, his movements are a complete mystery. He stepped out of the cabin into the vast expanse of the Brooks Range, and the wilderness closed in behind him. Weeks passed. Back in Wisconsin, his friends waited for word. They knew communication would be non-existent, but they had an agreed-upon window for his return. His flight was scheduled for around November 11th. When that day came and went with no sign of Thomas, concern began to build. He wasn't on the flight. He hadn't checked in from Kobuk. The silence that was an expected part of his journey now felt terrifying. On November 11th, 2012, more than a month after his last diary entry, Thomas Seibold was officially reported missing. The authorities were now facing a familiar Alaskan problem. A highly capable person had vanished into a search area the size of a small country, and the very environment he loved was now the biggest obstacle to finding him. The Alaska State Troopers launched an immediate search. At first, they were hopeful. The lead sergeant knew Seibold was skilled. This wasn't a lost tourist. They flew aerial searches around the cabin and along the logical routes he might have taken toward Kobuk, scanning for any sign of life. A shelter, a fire, anything. They found nothing. The biggest problem was the delay. By the time he was reported missing, Thomas had already been gone for over a month. Any tracks he left were long gone, erased by wind and snow. By December, when friends from his survival school arrived to help with a ground search, conditions were extreme. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero, and the days shrank to just a few hours of dim twilight. Searching was now incredibly dangerous for the searchers themselves. Despite a massive effort, not a single trace of Thomas Seibold was ever found. No abandoned camp. No discarded gear. The search was eventually suspended. The authorities sadly acknowledged that without new leads, they couldn't justify the resources and the risk. So what's the most likely theory? Many suspect he fell victim to one of the area's countless rivers. While trying to cross the Ambler or one of its tributaries, he could have broken through thin ice and been swept away. In that frigid water, hypothermia would be almost instant. His body would have been carried downstream and trapped under the ice for the winter. The fact that no remains have ever been found along the riverbanks only deepens the mystery and supports the theory that the river took him completely. Thomas Seibold's story is terrifying because it proves that in Alaska, even expertise might not be enough. He did everything right. He was skilled, he was respectful, and he had a plan. But a single misstep, a foot on weak ice, a stumble on a slippery rock, could have been all it took. His story is a powerful reminder that Alaska is always testing you. It doesn't matter how many times you've passed before, one failure can be your last. The stories of Hale Boggs, Gary Sotherden, and Thomas Seibold are just 3 of thousands that make up Alaska's missing persons crisis. They reveal a truth that's more chilling than any fiction. If you find these stories about the raw power of the wild as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing. We're always exploring that line where human ambition meets the forces of nature. What do you think is the biggest, most underestimated danger in the Alaskan wilderness? Let us know in the comments below. A powerful politician, a young dreamer, and a seasoned expert. They came to the Alaskan wilderness with different goals, different skills, and different backgrounds. But they all met the same fate. They were consumed by the land, leaving behind mysteries that last to this day. Their stories show exactly why so many people disappear in Alaska. The vanished flight of Boggs and Begic speaks to the sheer scale of the state and its violent weather. The decades-long mystery of Gary Sotherden highlights the very real danger of wildlife and the wilderness's incredible power to hide a tragedy for nearly half a century. And the heartbreaking disappearance of Thomas Seibold is the ultimate warning. Even for those who know the wild best, one wrong step can be the difference between life and death. You don't need paranormal entities or secret plots to explain the enigma of the Alaska Triangle. The antagonist is, and always has been, the environment itself. It's the jagged rock. It's the river of ice that crushes with imperceptible force. It's the water cold enough to stop a heart in seconds. It is the bear, and it is the vast, soul-crushing emptiness where a person can vanish so completely, it's as if they were never there at all. The real story of Alaska's missing is written across the face of its magnificent, terrifying, and utterly indifferent landscape. What you think about this story? Write in the comment your opinion. On my channel, you can watch other revenge or cheating stories. See you soon, my dear viewer.